Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin, and we are happy to be back after the summer break, joined by Deborah Dunsire, Chair of Neurvati Neurosciences, multiple times board member, and a former CEO of Lundbeck. So what can our listeners look forward to in this episode, Simon?
Deborah is a highly seasoned executive with many years of experience in the industry, so we have a lot of questions for her. We're going to explore the difference between leading smaller biotechs versus bigger pharma companies. We're going to go over the ins and outs of strategy and executing strategy, and then we'll discuss the cold biotech winter and the capital constrained environment out there and need for prioritization in such an environment. And we'll also touch on the topic of diversity and development in organizations.
Before we go into the episode, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, as it helps us to attract new guests. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
Now, please welcome Deborah Dunsire.
So welcome, Deborah. Welcome to our podcast. We are happy to have you on.
It's great to be here. Good to see you again, Martin.
Good to see you. And should we maybe start the usual way? Could you introduce yourself to the listeners on our podcast?
I'm Deborah Dunsire. I am currently board member of multiple companies and was formerly CEO of Lundbeck, Millennium, Extrude, Forum, and have been in the biotech and pharma industry for over 35 years. And it's a pleasure to be here today.
We are happy to have you on, and I think we will uncover it right away because you have been moving between biotechs and pharma back and forth. So before we actually deep dive into the actual topics we have prepared today, I would like to touch upon a very specific thing, and that is related to your experience. So in one of your interviews with Biotech CEO Sisterhood, you mentioned something very specific, and you actually advocated for those kind of growth experiences where you get exposed to various disciplines and experiences that can challenge your beliefs. Could you tell us a little bit how that shaped perhaps your journey?
Yeah, so one of the things that I believe has been the biggest growth experiences in my both personal and professional life have been places where I've been moved to positions where I was out of my comfort zone. And some of those experiences are through moving countries. Because when you move out of a country that you know and where you're known, you know all the rules of engagement, there are so many things that are just intrinsic to how things operate in a given place. And you know all of those because you've grown up there or you've lived there a long time. And when you move to somewhere new, a different country, it forces you to challenge all of those assumptions about how things should be, how things should be done. And in doing that, you find new ways of doing things. You find both that you can challenge the place that you've moved to because they also have traditional ways of doing things, but you also learn from it. And in the combination of those experiences, there's growth and the definition of new ways of doing things. So I think those growth experiences both change you personally and grow you professionally, but they also bring tremendous strength to your ability to lead in different circumstances.
I can very much relate to it. Now slowly moving into the actual topic of the podcast. So you have moved a lot between the big pharma, then you went to biotech, then you actually went back to big pharma, and then you went back to the biotech. So I would like to zoom in on the differences that you see between big pharma and biotech. And then there are some obvious ones out there everyone knows about, and then there are maybe some hidden ones. In your interview with Cowen, you described that one of the hardest things for an executive coming out of big pharma into a smaller biotech is not to be surrounded by staff, and that you have to be ready to roll up your sleeve. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that shift?
Yeah, so in a very big company, there are specialized functions to take care of specific tasks, and I think of things like maybe market research, different types of finance, that in a big company, it makes sense to have that specialization because it can support a wide array of different parts of the business. In a tiny company, you don't have that. And so people need to be able within a function to be broader in their remit. And when I think about marketing, we have in big companies, you've got brand directors and then brand managers and market researchers and health economists and access people. In a smaller company, you might have one person who has to take care of all of those functions and work with potentially external sources to get input in the areas that they're less experienced with. And so that's the rolling up of sleeves. And I find that sometimes people who've been in a big pharma environment who like to have the ability to oversee what's happening, but not actually do it, find it a bit difficult moving into a smaller environment where, yes, actually you have to do that work again, because typically when they've moved up in the ranks in a big pharma, they've gone from being a person who does the work to being a person who oversees others doing that work. And of course, not just overseeing, but contributing to strategy. So I'm not suggesting that people in managerial positions are not doing important work. But in a smaller environment, you have to both deliver the strategy and make sure that it's tactically executed. And that can be a little bit of a change in vision of who you are once you've been at a high level in a big company.
And now zooming maybe on the vice versa part of it. So then, of course, going from a biotech to big pharma, are there perhaps some learnings that you can take away from the biotech way, where you have to roll up your sleeves and then going into the big company that you can actually utilize in a big pharma setting?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that you take from a smaller environment to a bigger one is an intolerance for the length of time decisions take. And so pushing on why do we need to take this amount of time? How do we streamline decision making? How do we circumvent the need to go through multiple committee layers? Are there ways of bringing the requisite input? Because in a big company, there are different functions that need to be brought in. Is there a better way of doing that and a faster way of doing it? So I think that's probably the biggest one that I would see that you take with you from a smaller environment to a bigger one.
My next question was exactly what would be the giveaway for perhaps CEOs of pharma companies that didn't get to experience the biotech setting, but I assume we just covered it, right?
Yes. Yeah, and I think, even as a company grows, and having been in smaller companies that grew, there's a challenge in growth to say people who used to be involved in decisions, as you get bigger, sometimes you can't involve everybody. And sometimes smaller companies have a great deal of trouble streamlining their own functions. And so everybody's involved. And that also doesn't bode well for a small company. But in a big company, that's even easier, that there are many, many people who have a legitimate right to know or be informed, but who sometimes it's mistaken that they need to be part of the decision. And I think getting involved, getting clear on how the decision needs to be made, who makes the decision, and who needs to be informed about the decision is really critical.
Yes, absolutely. And now on the flip side of it, so would you say there are some general learnings for perhaps the biotech leaders or biotech CEOs that didn't get to be in the big pharma, that they could take away something from the big pharma setting?
I think one of the things that I really value, that I kind of grew up in a bigger company, that's where I started my career, in a small affiliate of a big company, was that things are done well, that there's really well-trained people in all the functions that a more junior person can learn from. And so you get a very disciplined development just by observing and learning. And that there are processes that are put in place that make things happen at a high quality level. Perhaps the place that manifests the most easily is in manufacturing, because in a big company, it's done incredibly well most often, because it's been honed over years and years and years of practice, inspection, regulatory interaction, and there's a great deal of finesse. In a smaller company that's setting that up for the first time, there's many things that one can miss because you don't see exactly the importance of it until you have a regulatory inspection that doesn't go well or whatever. So, I think that being in a big company, you see things done at an extremely high level of competence. And in a smaller company, you can aspire to that. You can take some of those learnings with you. But in a small company, you won't have the resources to do everything a big company does. So having been in a big company, you also know what's most important. And I think that's one of the learnings that you take from a big company to a small company, is saying, okay, we need to build these functions in a gradual way over time. We can't do everything a big company does, but these are the most critical foundational elements that we have to have and we have to get right. So it enables you to direct the resources of a smaller company effectively, to say, again, the most important things at the right time, and not trying to do everything that a big company does.
Yes. We had an interview with Stefan Kristgal, venture capitalist here in Copenhagen. And he actually, when he was comparing the environments, he mentioned something about this sickness of a big pharma company, that sometimes it can be too rich, so it ends up spending money in ways that it doesn't necessarily have to. While, of course, in the biotech, you have to be more focused. You don't have all the resources, as you mentioned, right? So you really have to only do the things that enable you to essentially go to the next inflection point. Is that something you would also feel as a difference between the two, or because it didn't sound from the answer?
I really do think that that's feasible. And I think it happens in all companies. One of the things that I, as a board chairman, as a board member, that I counsel CEOs on of all sizes of company is, if you hire great people, they will do work. And if you've got too many people, they will be doing work, and they'll be trying to do great work and do their best. But that creates a lot of work. And everybody is trying to do their best, right? People who are employed, in my experience, the vast majority want to do great work. And if you've got too many people, you're creating work that doesn't need to be necessarily done. So it's really important to constantly be aware of what is the most important thing. What are the things that are catalytic to the business? And are we really focused there, or have we diluted our efforts more than we should?
That was very insightful.
Deborah, so what actually, can you take us into your thought process and your thinking when you step into a leadership role in a company with maybe hundreds of thousands of employees? Where do you start?
I think there's parallel tracks there. You're never doing just one thing at a time. So I think the first thing is to understand, what is the mission and the vision of this company, and what is its current strategy, and is that strategy likely to deliver on the mission and vision? So that's one kind of work stream or thought process ongoing. The next thing is to, the absolutely most critical resource that you have within a company to accomplish the mission and vision are the people. So the parallel track is understanding, who do you have within the company? Who are the leaders? What are their experiences? What are their motivations? How do they lead? And in doing so, understanding what are the values that this company holds, and are those values aligned with the mission, vision, and the generation of the strategy? And then understanding the structure of the company and the people within that structure below the leadership level. Are we structured in a way that drives the strategy forward to accomplish the vision and mission? And do we have the right resources? Do we have the right skill sets? So, evaluating both of those in parallel is really important, because you're going to need to define as a new leader, okay, what is the strategy of the company that needs to be in place? Is the strategy it was pursuing spot on, and we need to continue in that direction, or is there a need for change? And obviously the situation of the company at the time is going to tell you whether there's a need for change. And once you define there's a need for change, then defining, okay, what is it that we need to do? How is it that we need to change? What pieces change and what pieces need to stay the same? Because that then has the knock-on effect of, right, now we need, for this new strategy, do we have the right people? So I guess to summarize, the two parallel work streams are mission, vision, and what's the appropriate strategy, and then who are the appropriate people? Because only with the right people can you accomplish the goal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Deborah. And in our intro chat, you also mentioned that it's very important to figure out what the company is truly good at. So how do you, along in this process, figure out what is an organization truly great at doing? Is that something that emerges as you onboard yourself and get into the weeds, or?
I think sometimes it emerges very quickly, and in smaller companies, it's sort of a startup environment.
Yeah.
It's really that founding idea that you're thinking about and saying, this is the idea that's going to create the innovation that we're looking for. So kind of resolving those two threads of what's the strategy and who are the right people happens much faster in a smaller organization. In a bigger organization that's involved in multiple different businesses or areas of work, you have a lot more to unpack. And looking at the history of the company is helpful and important, but not necessarily decisive. Because you think about companies that have changed over time, right? So I think about, Novartis, and I think about its history. It started as a dye company for dyeing silks. But over time, it moved into chemicals. It moved into pharmaceuticals. It moved over time from more of a cardiovascular company into much more of an oncology and specialty company. So the history is valuable and you need to understand it, but you need to be looking at where is the business going to be best served? How are you going to deliver for your stakeholders, including your shareholders, in the current environment versus what was there in the past? So a company can be extremely good at something in the past, but if that market is changing, and of course the example that people always quote is Kodak, right? Being a film company, and they were excellent at it. But a new technology changed everything, and they didn't figure out that their fundamental business underpinnings needed to change. So history is valuable, but don't get locked up in a historical framework.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very nicely captured. And then to my next question. So, of course, there's always this dichotomy between strategy and execution. So how do you see those two, and how do you go about executing?
Well, I think that they're two sides of a coin, if you like, right? The greatest strategy not executed gets you nowhere, and execution without a strategy takes you nowhere. So they're intimately linked. So I think that, with companies, particularly large companies, you in some ways are evolving strategy while the business is running. So you have to ensure that you are executing extremely effectively on the current business, because that is what's the flywheel that's driving your financial ability to move into the future. So you can't abandon what is today paying the bills, but you can't not shift to that future if you see the environment changing. Now, when I think about a company like Lundbeck, where I was the CEO, Lundbeck had been outstanding in innovating in psychiatry, but there was limited new biology to say we can continue to innovate successfully there. But Lundbeck's understanding of the brain and the neuroscience of the brain lent itself well to adding and continuing to add more in the neurology setting. So that's the direction that we took the company. And, I think that that's an example of a company that has had great success and has great expertise. And you can broaden that expertise. You don't have to jump to a totally different playing field where the company has never been before. You can build on that expertise and expand it. You don't have to stay in one place.
No, I think that's a really nice capture of this, Deborah. We have a common theme here on the podcast, and that's sort of the link and relationship between an executive team and the board of directors, and you have experience from both. So how do these two entities, the leadership and the board, work together in driving value creation? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
I think the leadership team and the management drive the business. They're the team that generates the strategy based on their understanding of all the business levers that are within that business. And the board of directors is there as a sounding board for the strategy, as advisory to the strategy, given that the board of directors typically has a wide range of different experiences to be able to ask appropriate questions, challenge the assumptions that underpin a strategy, and offer advice based on their different experiences. But it's ultimately the management that need to execute. Boards of directors are present as governance representatives in public companies of shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed in private companies the same is true. So ensuring that the strategy of the company is likely to deliver the results that shareholders expect is particularly the role of the board in governance. So if the management is proposing a strategy that the board of directors doesn't feel confident will be able to deliver the results that shareholders expect, then it's the board's role to change the CEO. So boards don't govern the whole of management. Their role is the hiring and firing of the CEO. But it's really, that should be a rare entity, right? The board is not managing a company. And so they pick a leader and they evaluate that leader in terms of their leader's ability to deliver a strategy that will give appropriate results to shareholders, and that they evaluate that leader on their ability to build a team and the teams below that to be able to execute on that strategy. So, boards of directors, it's the traditional statement that all boards learn as you become a director is you have your nose in and your fingers out.
Sure.
Because you're not you're not the people creating the strategy.
I think that's a very clear way of putting it. And now I'll change the subject a little bit. We also have to discuss this, what we could call navigating the biotech winter. And right now we are in a capital-constrained environment where prioritization and also realism in strategy is ever more important. So how do you see the current funding environment, and do you agree that we have a biotech winter?
Well, I think the inflows of capital, the creation of new companies, the number of IPOs, all tell us that, yes, we do. We are not seeing the inflows of capital from particularly generalist shareholders. They've really fled the space. We do still have, of course, the specialist healthcare investors, but a lot of them have experienced significant downsides in the companies that they're holding. And so they've had to deploy more of their own capital against those companies.
Yeah.
So that really has created a tremendous downdraft for the creation of new companies, for the financing of existing companies. We've seen record numbers of companies basically closing down. And we definitely have not seen the initial public offerings. There's some, I think, modicum of opening up, but there's so much uncertainty in the geopolitical environment, in the economic environment with threats of tariffs in the US discussing most favored nation pricing,
Yeah.
that a lot of investors are sitting on the sidelines waiting for things to clarify, to understand how they should invest for the future. So I think we're going to be in a capital constrained environment for some time yet. And it's not because there's not money available for investing, but it's going to other more certain areas right now. Healthcare, particularly biotech, and to some extent pharma, are being underweighted in portfolios because there's more certainty around other areas. I think we're seeing uncertainty in the regulatory environment. Is the regulator, particularly the FDA in the US, going to be more pro fast-moving approvals, or is it going to be significantly less friendly to innovation? And we've seen kind of both sides of that in a way. So I think the regulatory uncertainty is also causing a reticence for new investments because companies are thinking about, gosh, are we going to have a longer regulatory timeline? And so are we going to need more capital? Is our runway to approval going to be lengthened? And therefore we need more capital. And all of that creates an inability to invest in new things.
Yeah.
So forming companies right now is incredibly tough.
So now we agree that we are in a capital constrained environment and what we could call a biotech winter. We need to make the cash stretch a bit longer. So prioritization becomes really the key. So how should a company, let's say a biotech company, what's the prioritization process of thinking they should go through until this warms up again?
Well, I think that in the smallest of companies where they may have, one or two assets, I really say to those CEOs, look at the thing that will deliver the next catalyst.
Yeah.
It allows you to show investors the promise of return. And that's the thing you need to do.
Yeah.
All the other things that are super nice to do, very interesting, and possibly important innovations are unfortunately needing to take a back seat. Because, there's that old phrase, cash is king. Phrases like that exist because they're true. And so making your runway last so that you can deliver that catalyst is absolutely paramount. In bigger companies, obviously, they're making trade-offs between many different levers.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing that you look for is efficiencies. How can we be more efficient in our development? How can we, again, we'll be prioritizing, so we may need to slow some parts of our portfolio down. We may not be able to begin a phase 2 trial or, quite yet, because we've got to deliver on finishing these phase 3 trials, and that's requiring the capital. And then look for the efficiencies. How do we get these things done faster so that we're not taking 6 months more in accrual timeline because we chose the wrong sites or we didn't think of backup plans. So it's really driving speed to the next catalysts for all sizes of companies that I think is going to be critically important.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you already touched a little bit on it. So how in this environment, how do we actually balance this short-term survival with the long-term innovation perspective? Because there's a little bit of a dilemma there, I guess.
There is a dilemma, but, as a physician, you're trained, obviously you rotate about through emergency rooms. Staying alive is the most important thing. You can't really contemplate, are you going to be the world's best high jumper if you are not alive?
Yeah.
So that's the triage for companies right now. The first thing to do is make sure you get to your catalyst and stay alive. And then, yes, there will be a challenge for that future because there may be a gap between your first asset and your second asset because you had to delay that second asset. But, there are strategic partners and other partnerships that may be feasible. So I don't recommend companies just sit still with if they've got really a great second asset, maybe a strategic partnership on that versus holding it all to yourself is a good thing to do now. Maybe even you might even have to out-license it and send your child to be adopted where it can grow and develop, and you can gain some capital and buy yourself some time. So each circumstance is different, but I think the worst thing in the world is to starve everything because you're trying so hard to say, I can't only take care of the present, I've got to take care of the future, that everything is, you've got a delayed present and a future that's underfunded. And that's a way for a company to really end its life.
Yeah, no, I think that was very clear and practical advice. And then you mentioned that wishful thinking isn't a strategy when we spoke earlier. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and maybe give examples if you've seen it?
Well, I think that I have seen companies who will take a molecule that they believe in and that has really good fundamental biology, but it's known biology and it won't be competitive because it's late unless it goes into a new indication where nobody else has taken those things. And sometimes the biology is simply not strong enough, but because they created a good molecule and it's got good pharmaceutical properties and it's good for the known biology, they'll take a flyer, they'll wish for it to be successful, even when the biological underpinnings are much less clear.
Yeah.
And they don't appreciate the risk that they're taking. And you get phrases like, but, we need something in our phase 3 pipeline. Well, what you need most are things in your phase 3 pipeline that are very successful. So those are the kinds of wishful thinkings that I've seen.
Yeah, no, and it's probably very human to be a little bit too optimistic, but it can be very detrimental in a company for its value creation. So I will hand it back to you, Martin.
Thank you. And Deborah, now we of course discuss the companies, we discuss differences between companies of different sizes in the industry. But I would like to zoom out on something you actually mentioned quite a lot in our original chat, and that was the connection between the company and the broader ecosystem, and how can they collaborate more to essentially create more value. So I would like to start by distinguishing, in your view, what can companies do within their own four walls to create value, and what needs to happen in the broader ecosystem? In other words, where does essentially the CEO's influence extend beyond the company, whether it's working with the industry peers, influencing policy in order to improve odds of success for everyone?
Yeah, so, within the four walls of the company, you have whatever it is your unique capabilities are. Let's call it your innovation engine. And then you have the resources, your people and your financial resources, and you need to be thinking about how do we apply that to, we've talked about it, drive the biggest catalyst, the most important assets for the company forward in the most efficient way. And, thinking about maybe we do have too many things for us to be able to do alone. Can we partner? Is there a creative way of partnering some of our assets that give us access to another molecule or something that we can share risk on? And I think about Lundbeck's partnership with Otsuka that way, where multiple products were put into the partnership and both companies were able to share costs and share benefit. So thinking beyond your walls to say, where can we partner? But those are very specific to the company. And then there's the environment in which the company operates. And those are what I call the framework conditions for the company. And, each company CEO is accountable to their own shareholders, accountable to their board. So they really need to make sure their company is functioning well and well focused. But if we exist in a framework where, the business rules or the questions about intellectual property are being undermined, then it is up to the companies for whom that is critical to their business outcomes, to engage with that broader ecosystem and begin to educate and help, for instance, lawmakers understand how the impact of their laws might affect the ability of companies in their economic environment to function successfully. And so, I hear from a lot of CEOs, I don't have time. And I understand that because it's certainly a busy job. And it is vital that your first loyalty is to your company. However, if you don't engage with the framework conditions, you could find your company operating in a framework that ensures that it will be economically much less successful.
Yeah.
And so it is a part of your role as a CEO, as the leadership team, to engage with the outside world in the concept of these framework conditions. How do you improve manufacturing incentives to build new plants in the country? If you get better incentives in another country, and your government is arguing for you to build in their country, you need to help them understand why it's not economically viable, or it underserves your shareholders to do that, because then you can enhance the framework conditions for your company within your industry. So I view that as an incredibly important part of the work. But of course, nothing supersedes your loyalty to your own company.
Can I ask, so let's say you are a more junior CEO, how can I start engaging myself in this debate?
One of the ways I learned about that was engaging with trade associations. So representing my company on the board of one of the trade associations. And in the US, we have the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association for the bigger companies, and then the smaller companies and the startup companies are within the Biotechnology Innovation Organization Trade Association.
Yeah.
And those trade associations can harness the CEOs and the various groups. They have legal groups, IP groups, regulatory groups. They can harness the input from the companies. They can also connect companies and lawmakers. And whenever I've been to, for instance, Capitol Hill to call on Democratic and Republican senators and Congress people, they've been so appreciative of hearing from the companies, and particularly small companies, because countries know that small companies are the genesis of the next big companies. And so they're very interested in understanding what is the framework conditions for those small companies to be successful. And what is the innovation happening in those small companies? When I was in Denmark, engaging with the Dansk Industri, that's a way of engaging with the lawmakers within Denmark, the different, Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Health, so that they can understand what are the framework conditions that make Danish businesses successful.
There have been many things here that I would like to unpack a little bit. And the first one is, you mentioned this, you sometimes hear that the CEOs are often too busy to go to Washington. And I think currently we are in times where I would expect they are a lot in Washington and they really want to be there today, especially with all the policies that are being shaped around it. So I think it is very relevant. And I think you put something very nicely around, and that is, yes, you might want to focus on your own four walls, but what happens outside of those four walls is going to affect what you will be allowed to do within your four walls, right? So access to capital and other things might be affected by what happens outside. So being involved can greatly affect what you are allowed to do in the end.
Yes, and be a voice. Individuals within the lawmaking environment, the regulatory environment, are people too. And sometimes it's easy for them to look at an industry in a pretty amorphous way. So helping them understand what actually is the work that gets done. And I've hosted lawmakers in Denmark, in the US, in my companies, and had them meet scientists, see the bench work being done, the manufacturing facilities, see what it takes, and work with them through how long a particular product that has come to the market, where did it start and how long did it take? And it's a new vision for them. And educating people is critically important. If people don't understand their business, they're more likely to have a negative view than if you allow them to understand it better.
That's a great takeaway. And I'm wondering, so of course, also currently in the challenging environment beyond just the government, and I think you mentioned some, how important is collaboration within the industry itself? So for instance, during challenging times, like I don't think it's a stretch to say that's currently, do you see value in companies partnering or banding together through, let's say, industry groups or alliances in order to weather the common challenges?
Well, the first thing to say is that there are certain things that where industry cannot collaborate. Right? Pricing is one of those. So you have to be 100% clear on where collaboration is allowed and legal. So you need very good advisors to be sure that you maintain the legal framework. And then it's cartels are not allowed. So when we come together as an industry, it's really to learn and share experiences and to figure out which are the framework conditions that need to be understood and addressed. So for instance, around intellectual property, what we can all look at it and say, this affects all of us within the industry, and try to come to an agreement within the industry. Sometimes it's very difficult because it's easier for lawmakers to understand one ask than many different asks. If different companies have different viewpoints and they're going to the lawmakers by themselves, the lawmakers have to figure out, okay, what are we going to land on here? And they're not as experienced as we are, given that we live in this industry. So trying to, among companies that are competitive and that do have different drivers, I think about the difference between payment for biologics or IP for biologics and IP for small molecules in the US. Biologics companies have a different view than small molecule companies. But somehow being able to navigate a difficult path between what is the most important for your own company, remember where our first loyalty as CEOs is to our own company, versus how do we navigate to a place that gives us the best outcome for our industry. That's a super difficult area, but it's one that we have to lean into and address. Because if we can come to lawmakers and say, we agree that this would be the best way to go, it makes it easier for the lawmaker rather than having to adjudicate among multiple different industry positions.
Absolutely. I think that has been a great takeaway and also very practical for many companies, hopefully. We are nearing towards the end. It's less of a topic, but it's something that we thought is important to address. We, together with Simone, when we had our reflection episode, after, I believe, 7 guests in, we noticed this weird pattern where after 7 episodes of having only men on our podcast, we noticed that we actually had more self-invited men coming our way than women replying to our requests, even though we try to be very balanced in our outreach. And when I was listening to some of your podcasts, one specifically with Cohen, I noticed you raise a very similar dynamic in general. And that is in that women perhaps tend to be more hesitant to take a certain step and say things like, well, I need perhaps a bit more experience, or they tend to want to be noticed, while men are prepared to put themselves forward, which is something we very much see here. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about this and maybe share some experience or advice or strategies for women that feel like they can relate to that?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting dynamic. I think what you're seeing is 2 things. There are 2 influences happening. We know that women are managing most of the family at home, still, even in places like Scandinavia, still happens, that often they're busy, right? And it's not that men aren't busy, they're busy too. But women will tend to say, I've got my work to do. I've got these family obligations. I've got, take care of aging parent obligations. I simply need to get all of those things done. And so they are, in my experience, much less likely, particularly in the mid-career, to be engaged in networking, which is, it's very easy and very common for men to do. And so I do encourage women to make sure that they do engage in networking, not only because you learn in every interaction outside of your own job or company, you learn new things. So it's super valuable from that perspective, but it comes at a time cost. So I try to help women understand that is an important part of your career path, potentially. And of course, the other thing is we've seen over generations of research now that men will, once they've mastered about, 75 to 80% of the role, be wanting to take a next step. Women will want to feel mastery of, closer to 100% of the role before they will take the next step. And I think there's maybe a piece of that in the fact that people are not as responsive. I'd say in your podcast case, it's likely the fact of time that's more at work. In seeking promotion within a company, there's often more of women waiting to be tapped on the shoulder and told, we've observed, how effective you are. We'd like you to take on this next level. And what tends to happen is we've noticed how effective you are. We'd like to give you more work to do because you're so effective. And I think it is important for managers to hear from their employees, what are their growth goals? If a manager thinks that you're very comfortable and super occupied in your current role, they do hesitate to say, is this the person who can take on that next level? So it's important for everybody. Men tend to do it more easily, but it's important for everybody to be able to talk to their manager about what it is that they aspire to in growing. And that doesn't mean saying to a manager when you're, newly hired, hey, I want to be the CEO, how do I get there? That just tends to get viewed as a very arrogant person. But to be saying, I'm here, I'm excited about the work I'm doing, but these are the places that I'd like to grow.
Yes.
Here are other interesting jobs that I've seen in the company. How would I add skills that would enable me to potentially pursue that path? Seeking advice, at the same time letting it be known what you're interested in and how you would like to move forward. And to be able to say also, once you've been in a role and you've executed very effectively, to say, I've enjoyed what I'm doing. I'm very engaged. I want to stay with this company, but I feel like I could learn more. I could grow more. What could be the next step that I could take?
Can I ask, because you mentioned that you also sometimes mentor women, and I'm wondering specifically about this dynamic that you mentioned, that men tend to, after being 75%, 80% done, now they feel like they are ready to go to the next step, while women maybe tend to wait. I'm wondering, would you then advise the woman to actually, even if they are uncomfortable with it, go and try to make the step to basically come forward and say, I feel like I'm ready?
Well, yes, I would. I would say that it needs to be a constant and ongoing dialogue with the people with whom you are working, to be saying, how do I keep growing? It doesn't mean to say that even when you are, when you just come into a role, I'd say, yes, you need to do it for some time. But then even after a year, to say, okay, how do I prepare myself? You don't need to be saying, I need to change right now, but how do I prepare myself? Here are the things I'm interested in. So I do think there is that. And if you are feeling a little bit bored and stuck, it's really important that your manager know that, hey, I've done this. I feel really competent. I'm ready for something new. Because otherwise, companies will lose great people, right? And talent is the most important resource. So companies want to keep great people. So if you're bored and stuck and waiting for somebody else to come in and fix it for you, and they don't know what you want, you're likely to leave ultimately. And that's not constructive. So I would say the most constructive thing you can do is keep that ongoing dialogue, because then it makes it much less of a anxiety-provoking hill to climb, right? If it's just being routine, every half year, the mid-year say, here's where I am, and this is what I've learned. Here's what I'm interested in learning. Gee, I had an interaction with this particular function, let's say project management. Super interesting. Is that a type of thing I could think about? What are the skills I need for that? But just have that ongoing dialogue so that it's not a big deal to talk about what you want to do in the future.
I was just thinking also on this theme. So you mentioned the introspection and the proactivity, but is there any specific advice to the males out there who are in some position of power, what they should be attentive to?
Well, I think for people who are managing a diverse group of people, right? Because there's diversity both in gender, there's diversity in ethnicity, and different ethnicities also communicate their needs differently. So, particularly the Asian community in a Western environment don't communicate in the same way their ambition. In Japan, you are sort of expected to wait for your manager to tap you on the shoulder. So any manager needs to look at the person that they're managing and be asking each of those people, where are you feeling that you're growing? Where do you feel you would still like to grow? And I think for any manager, that you do that in each individual and that you listen with insight to the answer. And the reason I say with insight is because if you only interpret, if you're only responsive to people who say, I'm ready and I want my next job, that's most clearly stated in the Western tradition by white men.
Yeah.
You might hear it differently from a woman or an Asian person or a Black person. It might be expressed differently. So when it's a question of listening with insight and not saying, not interpreting a lack of hearing it in that exact way as a lack of ambition. And that's what we mean by opening up your unconscious bias. Right? When we think about helping people understand what their unconscious biases are, it's to open that window to say, gosh, I hadn't realized that I only hear ambition when it's stated this way. I need to be a bit more attentive to how it's being phrased by somebody who comes from a different cultural background.
Well, I think that was very thought-provoking and very practical. So we are coming towards the end. Is there anything we didn't discuss that you feel is important to add before we end our conversation?
I think you've covered a huge amount, and it's been a fun conversation for me. I hope that it meets the needs of your audience. You know your audience better than I do.
No, I'm absolutely sure this will be well received. We have this question we always ask our guests. So what have you been reading lately?
Gosh, I just finished, actually for the second time, a book called The Song of the Cell. And there's a series of 3 books written by an oncologist who works, I believe, at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Siddhartha Mukherjee.
Yeah.
And he started with the book, The Emperor of All Maladies. And he writes the history of cancer and cancer treatment. And then he has a book called The Gene. And he takes the history of the understanding of how genetics became understood, how DNA got discovered, the inheritance patterns, RNA. And then the third book is The Song of the Cell. And he looks at the history of how would we come to understand that beings were made up of cells, and then what happens within cells and how cells function. And it's the most remarkable historical, but also scientific treatise. And he writes incredibly approachably. So that's the book I've just finished.
Well, I think that's well received, the book recommendations. I was only familiar with the two other books. And if our listeners want to get in touch with you, is there any preferred way?
Probably LinkedIn is the best.
Yeah. But I think this concludes our very insightful conversation. So thank you so much, Deborah, for taking the time to chat with us today.
It's been a pleasure to reconnect with both of you. I enjoyed working with you, and it's great to see you both again and to see you doing this podcast. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So, Simon, this concludes our interview. Deborah, what did you take away?
I took a lot away, Martin. I think maybe let's get it done with the biotech window, because that's always a little bit sad one. But I think I would like to repeat also the actionable insight here, that what should biotech companies do in this chilly capital constrained environment. There's a lot of uncertainty. Biotech stocks have not fared well and so on. I think the ability to prioritize as a biotech company, or other companies as well, I think that prioritization ability is extremely important. And I also see it from time to time, if not every week, you see these small companies, they want to do so much, right? So even you think you maybe you need to build a pipeline or whatever, but maybe you just need to focus on one asset and getting one asset to the next value inflection point, the next value catalyst. And I think that's actually something that's operationally addressable for a company. Even whatever most favored nation, FDA layoffs and investor sentiment. So I think that's solid advice. What about you?
I think there was also a lot of advice for pharma companies, right? Even though they maybe don't have to prioritize as much, but as Deborah said, they still have to think about their productivity. So it's not like it doesn't touch them at all. She also had some really nice metaphors for how to prioritize or how to think about prioritization, especially when it comes to biotechs, right? As she said, the worst thing you can do is to try to starve everything. So you really have to focus. And I think she had some really nice metaphors, especially for, I believe it was adoption. It's not just about, do I do it all or nothing? You can still think of partnerships and trying to give it to someone else. So I really like that perspective of how do you think holistically of value creation. It's not just, do I do it or do I not, and delay. I mean, you can still have a small portion of some pie if you just partnered with someone, rather than have 100% of nothing. So I really like that perspective.
Another point was about the wishful thinking. I think that really resonates well with this podcast. Not that we are wishful thinkers, but I think when we look at portfolio strategy, portfolio planning, execution, this is also part of the psychology and also how organizations behave. And we see, I mean, there is the progression seeking behavior. We see this, if you have a empty or half empty pipeline, it's so tempting to push something forward so it looks like you have volume, but it's not about volume, it's about value. And I think Deborah really put that nicely. So I think that's for biotechs, but it's also for mid-size and large companies. I mean, it's not about the number you have in mid or late stage, it's about the quality shots on goal you have. And I think also it comes back maybe to another discussion we had in the previous episode, also around the probability of success. That's actually, it's about the intrinsic asset qualities, the technical qualities, and there's decision making you apply. And if you just push it forward, then you don't have the decision making quality built into or baked into your probability of success. So I think, but it's so tempting to push things forward when you have looked at that project maybe for many years. But maybe the wisest decision could be to deprioritize sometimes, but easier said than done.
I mean, it's such a dangerous sentence she said, right? We need something in the pipeline, so we are going to do this project. I mean, the moment that's your reason to progress something, then you kind of know that might not be good enough. And I think, as you said, I always think back to our interview with Jax Cannell, where he said the probability of success is a composite of the good decision to progress good molecules and bad decision to progress bad molecules. And I mean, we still have to be mindful that not having something in the pipeline can sometimes really be better than having something that is just eating up the resources of other things and starving everything else, right? It's a huge opportunity cost.
But I think the mantra, we need something in our pipeline, I think that's a dangerous mantra, as you say, Martin. And I think, but it's probably something that's you would hear often on the executive floor around the world, because it's easy to criticize an empty pipeline. It's harder to criticize maybe a full pipeline, or it's more tricky to maybe debate the quality of the pipeline.
It's a tough exercise, right? It might be hard to communicate that you have nothing there. I mean, I fully understand the pressure, but also at the same time, it has this huge rippling effect. It's like, okay, so I'll just fill it up for now while we get something good, right? So you are spending resources on something that is maybe not that good. And then it goes to the market potentially or hopefully, and then it underperforms, right? And then it decreases the confidence of the market about the rest of your pipeline, right? So it's like, it has this huge rippling effect where, I mean, I see and I fully understand the motivation, but is it really worth it? Is that the best thing you can do? I mean, it's like sometimes it might just be better to pay out the dividend. If you have the thing in your pipeline that is really there just to be there, then that might just be the opportunity to pay out the dividend, where it's like, that's one of those situations where it might actually be worth it.
Yeah, and I think it's also the aspect of time. So maybe, I'm not sure I would agree we should pay out dividends. I'd rather channel them back than maybe into the early pipeline. But of course, then it's a longer time horizon before you might see the fruits coming out of that. But rather that than, of course, putting into a mediocre asset at mid or late stage. But again, the timing aspect, because you have the patent cliff of your molecule, so you have to push something, and you cannot just only fund your early research. So is it then better to fund a mediocre asset and hope for the best, which is wishful thinking? Or how are you gonna do it right? So we can say, you shouldn't starve, and of course, there will be no long term without short term. So it is tricky, and it's not most drug projects, they're kind of maybe gray zone projects. So it's not that easy to see if they really could be converted into diamonds under some pressure. And I mean, for every project almost in the industry, right, failure is the default outcome. So, but that's still, all these remarks should not be an excuse for subscribing to wishful thinking and pushing crap into the pipeline. Yeah, and then we also covered growing as leaders and the gender gap in the industry among leaders and so on. Is there anything particular you took away from?
I think there was almost at the end of the topic or this theme, she mentioned something nice about, I mean, of course, we need to be aware of the biases, but I think she mentioned something nice that I never really thought about before, and that was, you shouldn't assume that someone is not ambitious just because they don't reflect ambitiousness in exactly the same way, right? Mm-hmm. I'm ready to go to the next step. That's my ambition. And I mean, I can very much relate to it. I when she said it, I heard those words many times before. And then sometimes it's easy to just say, well, okay, this person didn't say it, so they are not as ambitious. But that's not something I was actively thinking about, that I think is something people should think about more, right? Just because they don't say it, that doesn't mean they're not ambitious. They might just express it differently. That was a very nice perspective.
No, I agree. No, I agree. I think you said it perfectly, so I'll not try to do it better, Martin. I think that was a very good advice. So I think our listeners maybe that should be the last few words for this episode. So don't assume that your team members, who are maybe a little bit quiet, are not as ambitious as the most loud ones. And it's the responsibility of the leader to tease out that level of ambition among the team members.
But I'll also flip it a little bit, just to close it on a different note. I think she also said something that was very important, that it's important to be proactive, right? If you wait for it and do it once every 2 years, then it feels like such an obstacle to climb. But if you are proactive in your conversations and have it on a continuous basis, then it's just a natural thing to do. So I also really like that. I think it goes both ways.
It takes two to tango.
Yes, exactly. That's a way to close.
That's the way to close. Let's close it here, Martin. And as always, please visit our page on LinkedIn. Just search for Cures and Capital Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So please subscribe. Please mention the podcast to a friend or colleague. And then do not hesitate to reach out to Martin or myself, either on LinkedIn, or you can find us online in many places. I would be happy also to take suggestions for future guests and topics. Please just drop us a note. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.